So welcome, Amrit and Rabindra. And thank you for speaking with us today. So we start with, how did the representation of flowers in your creative practice begin?
Well, I guess it began with the kind of art. I should start by saying thank you for inviting us here, and thank you everybody for being here. Too enthusiastic to start. I guess it started with the kinds of artwork that we were inspired by as young art students, and even before we were students, and with a few examples on screen. Many art forms, actually. Our work is quite eclectic, and of course there are many world artistic traditions that feature flowers. But for us, it was the tradition of Persian and Indian miniature painting, which is exemplified on screen, left and middle there, and the decorative art movements of Europe, in particular Art Nouveau, and especially Alphonse Mucha, whose work is represented far right on screen. For all those traditions, it was the use of flora in a decorative, pretty much a decorative way, but the floral aspects of these works were absolutely central to the aesthetics of the artwork. And I think as youngsters and as students, we just fell in love with these styles. It was something that really connected with our own interests in art and our own sense of aesthetics as well. So we started to develop work that drew on these traditions. If we could move to the next slide. I think one thing to note before we move on is that the treatment of the flowers in these, particularly the Indian and Persian tradition, was that the flowers were very often stylized. And as time went on, they did get a bit more realistic, but that was a typical characteristic of the Indian style. So these are some of the traits that we picked up within our own work and emphasized within our work. Obviously, you can see the connection, I think, with the two works left and center with the Indian and Persian miniature aesthetic. But for us, I think the use of floral motifs and floral pattern went beyond the decorative at this stage, because this is work that we developed whilst we were studying for art at university. And the kind of interests that we had were really dismissed by our tutors. They said that Indian miniature, Persian miniature painting was backward and outdated and didn't have any place within contemporary art. Our response to that was to overemphasize those characteristics of the miniaturist tradition that we felt best represented it. And the floral motifs and patterns were part of that. And they actually became more, within our own works, a way for us to assert our identity and our affiliation with our Eastern heritage and our like of Indian aesthetics and Indian art forms. So although we're depicting themes that are set in the West, we're using the Indian aesthetics to give that overall style. So using flowers in the borders, for example, and stylizing the treatment of plants itself. So actually we did this particular piece, which is called Indian Summer at Digpal Nivas, which is depicting a typical day, a summer day in our own home in Bidston. And the reason we did this particular artwork is because we wanted to emulate the ways in which the Indian miniaturists treated foliage in particular. And I have to say that it started off with quite a lot of enthusiasm, but as time went on, as we were, doing the 1,000 tiny petals and leaves and dots and dashes, it actually took quite a lot of stamina to finish this particular piece, trying to represent all the flora in our garden. So I think much like planting an actual garden takes a lot of time, stamina, perseverance, but I think the end results are worth the effort, I would hope.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, in terms of the techniques you use here, and I think it was less digital here, maybe. I mean, assemblage and collage is something that Liverpool artists have been known for, and you bring the contemporary in through these techniques. Can you just say a little bit about the difference between the techniques here, and then when we'll move on to some of your more recent techniques?
Sure, yes. Well, these are all hand-painted work. So when we first began our journey as artists, we were very much trying to emulate the Indian miniaturist style, which was working with watercolor on paper base, using very, very small paint brushes, and also using a lot of gold illumination to give that quality that the miniaturists had. Still very similar in the way that we work now, which is using digital mediums combined with hand-painted elements too, but we're still having that sense of intricacy, detail, layering of information or imagery, if you like. And it's still just as time consuming, actually. People think sometimes digital artwork is quicker to do, but actually it's, in our case, and the style that we maintain, which is still trying to replicate that painting style, it's just as intricate.
Yes, thank you. And just in terms, I remember coming to the Manchester Museum, and the curator there from the British Museum told us some astonishing figures about Indian miniature paintings that were never seen, that were in their collections. There was so many of them, I think, in the British Museum. And sometimes the collections in our museums, the herbarium, the entomology, part of this work of getting the wild flowers out into nature. I mean, there is a lot of Indian miniatures in this country, isn't there, that are not seen?
Yeah, probably more in this country than in India, if the truth be known. And they have obviously the highest quality of miniatures, I would say, compared to what you can find in the museums in India.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I won't go off on a tangent. I'm sorry, I promised I wouldn't.
No, it's not a tangent. It actually ties in, I think, to the next.
So yes, in terms of the turning point where floral representation went beyond the purely decorative, you've talked a little about that. And then you sent us, I think, in 2016, when we did the Northern Flowerhouse Charter, I remember there was like a really, really long list of all of the flora that you'd done, both ornamental and otherwise. And it was just so comprehensive. But in terms of when flowers started to mean something different to you, can you talk a little bit about that in terms of the more recent bodies of work?
Yeah. Well, there were two projects in particular which introduced us more fully to the idea of the language of flowers, which is something that I think has been quite lost on people today, but was particularly popular in the Renaissance and also moving forward to the Victorian era, where every flower had a meaning, a symbolic meaning. And there was one particular project called that was the Barber Institute in Birmingham invited us to respond to one of their prize pre-Raphaelite paintings, which is this particular painting here by Rossetti, and called The Blue Bower. And within this particular portrait, the flowers have a particular symbolism. And this gave us an opportunity really to look into the history of the symbolic language of flowers and learn more about those particular meanings. And as a response to that, we produced a series called Facets of Femininity, which is this series of 8 portraits of modern women, if you like, using that idea of the language of flowers, but applying it to the particular portraits of each of these women. But it also did combine some of our knowledge of the traditional symbolism within Indian art too. So if we take the top left artwork of Margaret Thatcher, these telling of their times, they were done in the 90s. The flower that we use in the background, the lotus, has a symbolism within our Indian heritage in that it's likened to the pure soul. It's seen as this flower that is rooted in the mud, but it grows above the waters and turns its face into blossoms towards the sunshine. And that's likened to the pure soul of somebody who lives in this world, who leads a good life, but unaffected by the vices of this world. So this was a set of work that was combining those two traditions of both Western and Eastern floral symbolism. But you've turned the symbolism on its head, literally. So we have the lotus flowers, instead of being upturned, they're completely the opposite, downturned. So using it to represent the egotist as opposed to the pure soul.
Yes, thank you. It's always so enlightening to hear you talk about the symbolism in the work.
So there was a second project that we did, which gave us another opportunity to look at Western illuminated manuscripts, called the Heart Project. So you talked about collections before, Polly, and them being hidden away. This particular project was directly sort of addressing that issue of how to make those collections much more accessible to the public. So again, we were looking at manuscripts where the flowers had a particular symbolic meaning, obviously rooted in the Christian tradition in this instance. And it wasn't just the type of flower that had a symbolism. There was also, we learnt about the shapes of the flower. So sorry, in image, the far left image, there's a representation of a strawberry, which in Christian iconography and symbolism represented the pure soul. But it was also there for another purpose because of the three-pointed leaf of the strawberry, which represented the Trinity within Christianity. So we use a lot of this type of symbolism in our own portraits. So this portrait on the left of our uncle, we're employing that same symbolism of the strawberries, the pure soul, and also it represents a life of good deeds. And every floral representation in this artwork has a symbolic meaning. So, for example, in the landscape as well, you have the pine trees which represent the upright character of a person. And you have violets in the bottom register here, which represent humility. So these two artworks are very much inspired by the Christian illuminated manuscript tradition. I think probably you can see it more obviously on the right-hand side here, which was a much later work actually during the pandemic, where it was a tribute to the NHS workers, and it's called NHS versus COVID-19, Fighting on Two Fronts. So again, we're using a lot of imagery in here relating to that particular scenario where we wanted to pay tribute to the NHS.
Yes, thank you. So I think that the layers and the way that your research builds over time, I think it was 2013, wasn't it, when you came on one of our visits to Nantes, and perhaps the visit to the chateau and the slavery museum there sparked something around the slaves of fashion and how global the impact of the transatlantic slave trade was, and in relation to the plants associated with the history of empire and exploitation and colonization. This became a major theme for you.
It did, yes. It was at that time we'd seen some textiles in the museum there, in the slavery museum, which we thought were of Indian origin. But the curator, we thought they were of African origin because of the motifs, the colouring, the whole design of them. But the curator explained to us that they'd been actually made in India for the African market, where they were exchanged for enslaved Africans. And that was an eye-opener to us, because I think if you're taught anything about the history of slavery, which is not very often these days, or even in our time, one often just, they talk about the triangle and that's it. They don't really go beyond that. And here was an object in the museum, plant-based, a fabric made from cotton, that told another story, as you say, about the global dimension of that history. And that sparked a whole series of works called Slaves of Fashion, one of which is this triptych here. And it went beyond looking at purely the plants, but looking at the politics of the trade in those plants, particularly within the colonial context. This particular image, called Jallianwala Repression and Retribution, is actually depicting one of what's been defined as one of the most horrific episodes of colonial violence in India, which happened in 1919, called the Jallianwala Bagh Massacre. And it was basically when British troops opened fire on unarmed civilians who were protesting within the park against really harsh racist laws that were imposed by the British Raj at that time against Indian civilians. We've carried on our use of flowers within this artwork, and in fact across the whole series of artworks. And one of the things, for example, one of the little details within this work demonstrates how we use floral motifs to lead people into the story. So this detail shows one of the British soldiers standing on a carnation. Now, I'm sure many people will know that carnations were flowers that were given to troops. Particularly, we hear stories from our own perspective how Allied troops marching through France or Germany, for example, well, it wouldn't be Germany, France and other parts of Europe, were handed carnations by local women in appreciation of the sacrifices that they were making for the cause of World War I.
So it became a symbol of appreciation.
So yeah, in this instance, we're showing the soldiers stamping on the carnation because this massacre happened in 1919, right at the end of World War I, where Indian troops had just returned back to India. And actually India was expecting much more lenient and sympathetic treatment from the British Empire, instead of which, the screws were tightened. And it was this emblem, this symbol here, showing how all those sacrifices had been totally disregarded in the way that Indians were, being treated. There are two other floral symbols within, well, many more, but most obvious, we have two trees, one on the left, which is composed of flowers that represent what we felt were the characteristics of imperialism. So some of them represent avarice or greed, injustice, for example. And opposite that, on the other side of the artwork, you have another floral tree which represents the uniting of Indians against the oppression in India, against the Raj. So each of the flowers of this tree represent the three major religious traditions of India.
So you have the rose for Islam, the marigold for the Sikh faith, and the lotus for the Hindu faith. So all those three coming together against a common cause, for a common cause.
So I think this series was the beginnings of where we started to use floral motifs in a more political way, in a way, storytelling beyond the flower itself.
Thank you so much. So then moving into Botanical Tales and Seeds of Empire, which we were fortunate to come to the opening of at Kew Gardens in the Shirley Sherwood Gallery. Could you speak a bit about the journey of making this work and how perhaps the brief evolved during the process of your research and making of the work?
Okay. Yeah. Well, this work began as an invitation from Kew Gardens, and they have a collection of Indian botanical drawings that date back to the colonial period that were created, many of them by Indian artists. And these were artists that weren't given the recognition that they deserved, partly because of the kind of cultural hierarchies. Their talents weren't necessarily respected alongside the talent of Western botanical artists. But also because these drawings had a particular purpose, and they weren't created as objects of art. They were created as documentations of flora of India and other places around the British colonies around the globe, to document plants and to bring those visual documentations back to Kew and other botanical gardens where they could be studied, and they would gain some insights into how to cultivate these plants for commercial use.
So in asking us to respond to this particular collection, what struck us really, the question that we wanted to ask was why? Why, were these plants being studied so extensively? Why were they being brought from India? And this exhibition actually really gave us a chance to learn about not just the symbolism of plants, but the whole history really of plants and the economics behind the kind of exchange of plants globally, the cultivation of plants globally. And that became the main theme for the exhibition itself. And what we produced were very large-scale lightbox artworks. If I just
so on screen, there are two sets of work.
Yeah, I'll just give you a quick whiz around the show. So you can get an idea of the context of how the... So these are the botanical Indian historical paintings that started off the exhibition. So I think we'll leave the music off. And that led through to our exhibition, which we're coming to now with the blue walls. And so these were produced as very colourful, backlit lightbox artworks.
Yes, this portrait, very moving portrait of your father was a centerpiece, wasn't it?
Yes,
in this exhibition.
Yes. So we had the lightbox artworks around the edged walls, if you like. There were, I think, 10 pieces altogether.
12.
And then you just get a glimpse on the right-hand side there of some smaller artworks, which were introduced really to give a balance to the dialogues that we were having with the works on the outer wall. So you probably get that idea. So here we go. So this is the total collection. So it's split into two. So around the outer walls, we had the larger lightbox artworks, which are in the top half here. And in the center of the gallery, we wanted to really make a contrast between the story of exploitation of plants against the reverence that people had for plants at grassroots levels globally in terms of, ritual and folklore and all of that. So these are the light boxes. And then we had, I thought we had a picture of the other one. Sorry, we don't. But anyway, the bottom ones here, which were various folklore, folk tales, uses of particular plants within global cultures, which were at the centre.
Yeah, very, very vibrant colours, and each plant with its own story and symbolism on those smaller ones. But just to zoom in on the one of the doily, are you able to do that with tea? Because this is a very everyday thing that British people do. But this was extremely struck me, this one, because there's such a kind of dark, horrific side to the exploitation of what looks at first like a kind of nice floral display.
Yes, this piece it's called Dying for a Cuppa, and it was basically looking at the story of the link between tea and the opium trade, and obviously the kind of conflict with that, and the misery that came with the opium trade. It was inspired by this quote in the centre of the doily, which is, "Let the English who read this at home reflect that it is not the tea alone, but the impoverished blood of the slaves, devoid of its red seeds of life and vigour, that they are drinking." And so starting from that, around the edge, we have various words called drug addiction, conflict, deforestation, land grab and enslavement, all associated with this cultivation of tea. And so that was the starting point of this particular artwork. And then everything expands from there, really, in terms of the stories that we're telling of the opium trade in particular, and it's linked to tea cultivation. And conflict.
Thank you. I mean, so much to say about this collection, but I would really like to focus on the portrait that you did with the flowers from your own garden, because Fergus will talk about the importance of personal relationships and gardens. He loves being the people he loves, and the death of your father during the making of this exhibition, I think, had such an impact in terms of this particular work, bringing it really personal. Could you tell me a bit about how this changed your relationship to the flowers in this picture?
Well, yes. I mean, this portrait of our father at the centre, first of all, we knew when we were creating this exhibition, particularly after our father passed away, that we wanted to create a tribute to him that was part of that exhibition. And the portrait really of him, he's surrounded by the flowers from our own garden, which you can see through the window on the left here on the foothill of Biston Hill, which took on new meaning for us, a new appreciation, because he really loved our garden. And, that was the reason we bought the house, actually. It was particularly this fir tree or pine tree we have in the garden. We came to see the house and we saw the tree first, and my father said, right, this is the house for us. So he was very protective of the plants in our garden. He hated it even if even a daisy was picked out of the grass. He would love to see just the flowers grow wild. And so we started with the flowers in our garden, and we looked up all the symbolic meanings of those flowers, and the ones that resonated with our father's character we portrayed around his portrait in the same style as the illuminated Christian manuscripts that we'd obviously studied years before. And he also had very personal stories about particular plants in his life, particularly growing up as a child. So 4 of those little anecdotes also we wanted to represent in the 4 corners. So in the top left here, you have, he always used to tell us about how when he was a toddler in India, his aunt would take him to the jungle, and they would pick jasmine. Sorry, mind went blank. Yeah. So they would pick jasmine, and jasmine was always one of his favourite flowers. So that's the scene there. And then in the opposite corner, I'll start with this one because it's back in India again. He was best friends with his uncle in India, and he told us how they used to have the task of actually taking all the husks from the corn after it had been harvested to feed to the cattle. And the two of them would rifle through all the husks to see if they could find any sweet corn kind of hiding away in there and eat that on the way to doing that job. So that's the two of them munching on the corn. And then in the opposite corner, he tells another tale of how he and his uncle again used to go into the farmer's fields and pinch the sugarcane. And on one occasion, the farmer caught them and started shouting, "Oi mundia," which means like, "Hey boys," kind of, like, "Get out of my field." And he says how he and his uncle just really, legged it out of this field, thinking they were the only ones there. And when they kind of looked over their shoulders, they saw half a dozen other little boys running out from the sugarcane fields.
But all
and then the last one at the top, right hand. Sorry, I've gone too far. Oops. So when he came to England, he was only 9 years old, and at about 12 or 13, he was in the Boy Scouts. And he tells of how they went on a camping trip, and he wandered away from the camp and came across a field of daffodils, which he'd never seen before. And he said he was just so amazed and wondered by this beautiful yellow field. He rushed up and he gathered a lot of, of the daffodils to him. And again, got caught by the farmer and told off for picking the daffodils. But Wordsworth's poem, I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, was always one of his favourite poems because of that memory that he had as a child.
And so these plants have had we just view them differently because of the association with his life. We will never look at them in the same way. They're not just a flower plant. They're something that keep us connected and keep us remembering him. So this is how they came to be incorporated within the work. But it is also work that connects to the colonial story as well. The two sides of the two sets of work.
Before we move on to that, I just wanted to mention about the link of the idea of the garden with spirituality, because that was another starting point for this particular portrait. And in particular, the concept that to cultivate, that the soul is like a garden that you cultivate and you cherish, and that within your soul you cultivate the virtues, if you like, the right kind of virtues. And this was a starting point for this portrait too, because for us, going by that particular symbolism, our father was the perfect garden. He cultivated all those qualities. So we wrote this little poem underneath, "This perfect garden, a splendid sight, a faithful testament to inner light, each flower a virtue, sweet and right, a beautiful soul blossoming bright." So you have a lot of global cultures, this association with the garden as being paralleled with the soul and cultivating those qualities within you.
But the colonial link, because obviously the two sets of work within the show had to have some kind of logic to them. And this is one of the pieces in the show that connects both the colonial histories and the cultural significance of plants, in that it also represents the story of migration, which is obviously one of migration of plants and the migration of people, which is one of the legacies of colonial history. And that's referenced in the top right corner of this archway here by the dandelion flower.
So the dandelion flower is actually, it obviously comes from lion's teeth. That's how it's named. And all Sikhs, the surname for Sikh men is Singh. We come from the Sikh faith, and that means lion. So, and Sikh men often called the lions of Punjab. So we've used the dandelion to represent our father. And it's represented in the back on the cityscape of Amritsar, where he was born, which was his other favourite garden, if you like, back in India, with this complex in the Golden Temple. And from the dandelion, you have the seeds, giving this symbolism of migration represented through the seeds of the dandelion floating across from India to the Liverpool cityscape, where we eventually settled. So it's that idea of what empire brought. It didn't just bring migration of plants, it also brought migration of people and ideas and culture. And that's how we've represented that particular idea within the artwork.
Thank you so much. I do want to open up a couple of questions from the room as well, but before we break for lunch. But I think so many of the themes that you've evoked already are going to be picked up as well through the afternoon. Is there anybody who would like to ask Amrit and Rabindra a question about their work that you've seen? Yeah.
The exhibition is in Kew. We'll see it in Liverpool or
We hope so. You've missed the Q one, unfortunately, but it was really very popular, and I don't think it offered the best opportunity for most people to see it, because Q is a fee-paying venue, and that was one of the really disappointing things for us. The setting, the gallery, everything was wonderful, but it was a big disappointment that so many people couldn't afford to actually get the entry ticket to get into. And mostly our shows are free. We don't like to charge, but by the fact that it was in the garden walls, the confines of the wall, we didn't have a say in that. So we are going to try and tour the show. We are definitely going to try and bring it back home, to a venue closer to home. Best way of finding out about that is if you subscribe to our website, which you can unsubscribe anytime you like, but you usually will then get, the newsletters as where our work's going and, how long it's on for. So thank you for asking.
It's been a bit of a dream of mine to have some of their light boxes in bus stops, but we haven't quite worked out how to do that as yet. Yes, another question. Yes.
Lots of online.
I'll just repeat the question in case you didn't hear. The question is about the research. Was it through books or online, or how did the research go?
A combination of all of those things, really. There's quite a lot of information online on various sites. Also, quite a few specialist books and antique books as well. We bought quite a couple of Victorian books, which have a whole list of symbolism of different plants. And books on art. If you look at some of particularly books on Renaissance art, iconography, symbolism, a lot of it covers that tradition of using plants to, say something, to convey a message.
Yeah, I'd just like to pick up on the Slaves of Fashion there, because National Museums Liverpool, who've been so generous to Scouse Flowerhouse, I mean, that was based off the objects of their collection, and you have your own collection that you've been gathering over time as well.
Yeah, we feel very strongly about the connection between artistic practice and historical heritage. And one of the sort of similarities between Slaves of Fashion, which was hosted by NML in 2018, I think, off the back of the visit, and the Botanical Tales and Seeds of Empire exhibition at Kew, was this starting point of historical collections, which we wanted to use our work to bring out into the fore and to get people talking about the meaning of those collections and how they resonate with different communities from diverse backgrounds, interests and histories. And yes, the Slaves of Fashion was very much rooted in many of the objects in NML's collections that we studied before we created the artworks, but we didn't look at the obvious reading of those collections. We were more interested in, what can a chintz teapot tell you? It's not just about the story of tea and, tea time in England, but that you look at the patterning of the teapot. It's, that chintz pattern, which we often associate with quintessentially being, quintessentially English, but actually the chintz pattern and chintz word goes back to India and the chintz fabrics of India as well. So that unusual connection between different objects and the ways in which that can bring us into past histories, then also resonate with, the world that we live in and the communities that we live with, is what really interests us.
Yes, thank you. It's such a big job to continue interpreting the work with your books and films that go alongside to tell these stories, isn't it? I mean, that's something that's ongoing. Are you working on something for the Botanical Tales in that regard?
Yeah, obviously the touring the exhibition is one thing. It's only been shown in London so far. But we are going to be producing a coffee table book, which will really dissect every detail within each work. We've only just skimmed, a couple of works today, but every artwork is a book in itself. And so we do really want to bring something out that will enable people to have proper insights into the works.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. As Rabindra said, it's very much just a glimpse of the depth of some of these artworks, but I hope that it sparked your curiosity and that when the exhibition does come to the north of England, the connection with the plants and gardens and how we can research this can be really inspirational to many. What I would say about Liverpool is that the National Museums Liverpool and the World Museum is host to an incredible collection of over 400,000 plant species, and anybody can make an appointment to actually go and access that herbarium. And part of the agreement with the Eden Project is very much around enabling people working in garden settings and interested in plants to really access those collections, both entomology, so it's and plants. So that's something that I think the artworks of the Singh twins brings out, and we can do a lot more as well within our communities. So I'd like to thank the Singh twins now, and then just introduce David.
Thank you.
Thank you, Polly.
Thank you.